for it yesterday.
I did too.
No. So we had considered recording it,
Mm-hmm.
and Michael did not want it
Okay.
to be recorded.
That's fine.
Well, and we thought he might not want to stream it, but we thought we might still be able to record it. But that wasn't,
Yeah.
which makes sense, you know, because
Sure.
that's his living. All right, I want to hear what everyone thought about last week, and if you've maybe thought about Genesis since then, because I've talked with a few of you, and Donna even made us a chart that I'm going to ask you to show us in a little bit. But I want to hear if anyone else had thoughts from last week.
Well, I had a question.
Yeah.
When we were talking towards the end there about the flood story about Noah and the flood, and we talked about other religions had a
Yeah.
story very similar to that. I mean, what are you to really make of that?
So actually on this chart right here that I brought, and my charts I bought like a few weeks ago, they're still not here.
Oh, really?
But we're going to look at this one a little more in depth. So in Sumeria, there was actually a flood in,
Okay.
well, it has the date on it,
What was the date of the Sumerian flood?
in about 2900 BCE. So there was a flood there, like through the Euphrates and the Tigris, that flooded the area. And so that, when we kind of talked about a lot of these Sumerian and ancient Near Eastern creation stories all have this flood myth that kind of runs through them.
Okay.
And so here's this if you
Oh, that's
You wanted to
okay.
look at it.
I'm gonna listen to you, so.
So for me, what I make of it is that there was a devastating flood, and it became an important way of telling story. And so, and especially in Sumeria, that story becomes powerful. And so, what we're going to see when we read through ours is there's differences about our flood story. And so, it doesn't scare me that there's comparisons. I want to look at what's different
Okay.
because it tells us what the focus is.
I took a class in religious studies in college, and I wrote a paper on the Sumerian flood and
Oh,
compared
wow.
it to Noah's flood.
Oh, interesting.
And it was the most fun paper I ever wrote, and it was fun researching. But for the life of me, I cannot remember what the differences were.
You didn't say that, did you?
So have you read the Epic of Gilgamesh? You know, there's like, has anybody read the Epic of Gilgamesh or shortened versions?
I don't
time
remember if
ago.
I read that in my class a long time.
Oh man, okay. I'm gonna make a note. So when we get to Genesis 6, we're gonna read the Epic of Gilgamesh then, or at least we'll play maybe if I can find another funny short video about it. Let me make that note in here.
Well, I had heard, I knew that other religions had that same story,
Yeah.
but I was just, didn't realize that it originated with one flood that actually.
It could have, or maybe floods happen a lot, and they really they become powerful memories that you have.
Okay.
Did the Sumerian flood destroy the whole earth like Noah's flood did?
So the Hebrew word that's used is the land, and so it doesn't mean like a global earth. And so if you kind of wanted to read it more literally, it just means the land, which would be like the known world kind of that you have. But it was a very devastating flood that we still have the archaeological evidence to know within a century of when this flood happened, because it was big and destructive. And it was enough to kind of set back society to kind of,
Okay.
it wiped out a lot of things.
Didn't you say also that some of the other religions from other parts of the world, like South America and China, also had flood stories?
So I'm not as familiar with their stories. There might be, but like I had a class that did like all of South American things, and I don't remember specifics of them.
Okay.
So
I thought that I had read that other cultures also had flood stories in them. So it may not be the Sumerian flood that they're talking about. And it could be. I mean, we have no way of knowing. And this is before history. But it could be something else too.
Hello. Are you coming to our Genesis? Yeah. Oh, great. We're thinking about last week, and right now we're talking about different floods. Yeah, I'm not as sure, but what makes kind of the ancient Near Eastern creation stories unique is that most of them have floods. And they all kind of follow that similar timeline, like we watched that video of Enki in the flood. Although the story of Enki, it was like Adam and Eve were the ones on the ark when things started over, which is a little bit different again than ours. Alrics, did y'all have any things you've thought about this week from it?
No, I already read chapter 1 and I realized you said we didn't have to read it yet. So I'm usually behind on the 8 ball, not ahead of it. So I feel
Well,
pretty
John
good.
did make an interesting comment. He said, when I pulled up those cartoons on the iPad that you sent out.
Yeah.
I would have never thought of using cartoons to teach the Bible. And I said, as a former teacher, you do whatever you have to to get the point across.
Was that the different, this one?
No,
I actually had cartoons like a
Did you
picture of
see-
like Genesis, all of Genesis as a cartoon.
It was too small for me to even see.
This? I don't remember which one it was.
I don't remember.
Alexander, this one?
2 cartoons.
Oh, that one. Okay, yeah, we haven't shown that up here yet. Okay.
Okay. I was gonna say, I've already forgotten.
No, it's not. That's not. We haven't gotten to it yet. And in my office, I have 18 and a half by 14 that I forgot to grab. On my way, once I got to the church, I realized I had left this at home, and I had to turn around and come back. And I was still getting the printer going, and Janie's like, "Are we starting this class?" I got a little bit behind. So I wanted to catch up from last week. I talked with a few of you about some different things, which is why I wanted to kind of check back in. And as we looked sort of at these different sources and stuff, the one part I want to emphasize is Genesis is still one book. And same with the Bible, it's still one book. And so even though we looked at, it may have been compiled together over a long period of time and in different regions and even in different versions of Hebrew that get mixed and from different places and they have different ideas, the Genesis that we have was intentionally put together in the way that we have it because it's telling a particular story. And so sometimes it can be a little distracting to begin to take things apart. We're still going to do that in this class, but still remember, it's still one book. After some, did you have a thought?
And last week you said it had several authors.
And it has different authors, yes. And we're going to go a little more into detail. Some of the people I've talked to throughout the week, maybe that were in here last week or those that couldn't quite make it at this time yet, wanted to go a little more in detail in some of those different authors that we talked about. So do y'all want to spend a little more time looking at what we talked about last week with the sources?
Does it really
So, the other part is, I forget who, we were talking about the Bible together, and I went ahead and got this image that is of the Christian Bible and the way the Jewish Bible is arranged. And so, both of it, our first 5 books, we all put together because they're kind of the heart, like we had looked at in those kind of expanding circles. So for Jews, they call it the Torah. We call it the Pentateuch sometimes. I will use both. I usually say Torah. But then the difference is there's the next section in the Hebrew Bible is the Nehevim, which means the writings. And so like we looked at, we like to break things up into prophets and history. For them, it's all thrown together just in the writings. And so you have all of the prophets here, and then the 12, what we talked about last week, it's one scroll that has all of the minor prophets. So like Amos, Hosea, and things like that. They're all on one scroll. And they're arranged a little differently in the Hebrew Bible than they are in our Bible. And then their last section is the writings, which is the Psalms and the Proverbs. And what I always find unique is Daniel is not considered a prophet. So it's not under prophecy like we would put it in Christian Bibles. And that changes, to me, the way you look at Daniel.
So in the Jewish Bible, the whole thing, the whole column you just had listed, it's not called the Torah, just the first 5.
Just the first 5 books. So they call the whole thing an acronym. So it's Tanakh. So it's Torah, Nehevim, Ketuvim, Tanakh.
But it's all in one book.
It's all one collection. And this actually, the Christians, we finalized our Old Testament before the Jews did, which is kind of in the Masoretic text, which is what the Jews use, is written in Hebrew. It's later than what we use is the Septuagint, the Greek version. So what Jews use today was a later text than the Greek version.
I have a question. Do the Jewish folks consider the first 5 books more important or more holy, or whatever you want to say, than, I always got the impression from our Bible, everything was pretty much equal and just telling a story. But it seems to me that the Torah is something very special to them. But I'm not sure.
So that was, if you remember, I talked about with the circles.
Yeah.
That kind of the heart is the Torah, and everything is like an expanding circle. But we do the same thing with the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Like on our Sunday service, actually our 4 lectionary readings, it copies the way that Jews have their service today. There's 4 readings.
Mm-hmm.
In place of where we have the Gospel, they have the Torah. Where we have a Psalm, they have a Psalm. And then they have one from the prophets and one from the writings, like we have an Old and a New Testament. And so it really copies the same kind of idea that we have. But the heart there is Torah. It's in the middle. And Torah means law or teachings, instruction.
I see some, they look like they're faded out.
Yeah, so these are the apocryphal books.
And help me out with that a little bit.
So
Not in our Bible. They're not in this Bible that I've got, but I know like Catholics have it. Or
So we have it in the Anglican Bible. It's even in our lectionary. And so the difference was that these were written in Greek. The other ones were written in Hebrew. And so up until the Reformation, they were put in the same book. But it was the first King James Bible. It was kind of expensive to print it that way. So they took it out. And then some people were upset that they had taken it out. So they put it back in, but they put it in the middle. And then it came with the name the Deuterocanonical books, which means the second canon. And then more Protestant-leaning people would call it the apocryphal books, which means false. But the difference is that one is written in Greek, one is written in Hebrew in the version.
So that was the rationale for taking them out, because they were written in a different...
So, like the Christians kind of finalized their canon pretty early, and the focus more was on the Christian writings, so like the Gospels and the Epistles and things like that. Kind of the Old Testament was just collections of books that were being passed around, and so it wasn't as standardized as what people had. So some churches might regularly read from the other books, and some wouldn't. And it kind of came to do with printing. So even like in the Anglican Church, we read it for instruction and for history, but not for doctrine, is what we have in the original articles.
It seems like Alexander Christopher told us that they didn't qualify because they didn't talk enough about Jesus. There were certain things that weren't mentioned enough. It was sort of like they were inferior. They didn't meet the standards to be included.
That's not the perspective I take, but some might think that. I think mainly it just came with they were written in a different language and people put them in a different place, kind of thing. And that kind of follows more historically. The Old Testament that was passed around up until the Reformation, they were just kind of mixed in. And there are some books that have a really different flavor, though. Like, so Baruch, that's down here in prophecy, is kind of a different part of Daniel. And there's other Greek additions to Daniel, and they read, like, they're obviously written at a different point. And there's Greek additions to Esther as well. Hello. But yeah, I would say if you've never read one of the apocryphal books, you should definitely read the Maccabees books. So, do y'all know who Maccabees was?
Yeah, weren't they the Italian during the Renaissance? The Maccabees were the ruling part.
Medici.
Who is that? See, I'm not as familiar with Italian history.
Medici, you're right. I'm sorry.
So the Maccabees were like Judas Maccabees, which means the hammer. It was called the Hasmonean dynasty, and so they were the part between the testaments. So after the Old Testament was written, the Romans had come in and, the Greeks had come in. So the Seleucids, which were one of the successors to the Alexander the Great's empire. And so Maccabees was this Jewish family, and they went and so they rode into Jerusalem on a horse. And this is where it gets cool. Everyone laid down palm branches and they said, "Hosanna in the highest, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But he came on a war horse with his hammer, and he came in and he beat all the Greeks out, and they cleaned out the temple because they had set up like in the throne room, they had set up idols to Apollo and other gods. And so what's really cool is when you read Maccabees, you see the difference in the stories of Jesus. They say, "Hosanna in the highest, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," but Jesus comes on a donkey, not a war horse. That wasn't what we were going to talk about today. Do we have more questions about this?
Better keep going, otherwise.
Yeah, no, we're going to get stuck here. Any more questions on how the different testaments are arranged? Okay, great. So there's a few things I wanted to catch up from last week. And one of those was when we had mentioned the documentary hypothesis, or how there was kind of this idea that there's different sources that make up Genesis and all of the rest of the Old Testament. And I'll do just a brief catch up for that for those that weren't here. Let me just come back on my slides. So in the early 1800s, it became very clear that there was different sources that made up Genesis. We call those J, E, D, and P. So when we go through this course, we're going to use those different terms. And so J source uses Yahweh, which in German gets J. Elohist, the idea back then was that they used the word Elohim, which we translate as God. The Deuteronomist mainly wrote the book of Deuteronomy. And then the priestly source would be a type of priest that was called a Zadokite, which was different than the Levite priest. And so this idea kind of shook up the Bible world. And everybody's like, wow, how did I not see this? Because that seems really, really clear. So some of y'all wanted to go in a little more detail. So we're going to spend some time just looking at where those things become pretty clear, that there are these different sources. Today, there's kind of three main ideas of this source theory. The documentary hypothesis was the first one. So that's when you just have, there's four sources and they're stuck together and everything is in one of these blocks. That idea kind of evolved into what we call the supplementary hypothesis, which is that there's more than four sources, but you could kind of break them down into that, and they kind of build off of each other. And then the one we talked about, which was the dual origins, which was kind of, there's this main area that was in Israel and a main area in Judah. One of them is kind of more captivated by the story of Abraham. One is more by the story of Moses. And those have different connections, where the story of Moses is influenced by Egypt. The story of Abraham is influenced by Babylon and Assyria. And these kind of two schools come together that we have. So linguistically, I think some of you would like some of the stuff that we're about to read, but it comes from a book, The Bible with Sources, Revealed. That's by Friedman. I put that in there because I knew I would forget to say his name. I have this on Kindle if anyone wants to look at it. Most of what we're about to do when we look at the 7 things is straight from his book. Y'all have that written down? Okay. So the first one we're going to look at is different linguistic kind of evidence. So one thing to know is that there is, when we do Bible scholar things, we call it classical biblical Hebrew. And so that is when the first 5 books of the Bible were written. All of that linguistic period we call classical biblical Hebrew. Later, we have late biblical Hebrew, which is like post-exilic. So on our chart here, once like Maccabees and all of them come in, and once the Persians have come and reinstituted Israel back into the area after the exile, it's a different form of Hebrew because it had changed. It had been influenced by different languages. And we can track kind of the development of Hebrew. But what's really cool is that J and E, so the Yahweh source and the Elohi source, they're from this earliest Hebrew. Once we get to the P, so the priestly source, and if you remember in this class, we're mainly going to be using these two while we look at Genesis. There's the non-priestly, which we used to call J and E, and then the priestly. It's from the Babylonian kind of influenced Hebrew. And then the Deuteronomist Hebrew, it's from later Hebrew, but it's still the classical biblical Hebrew. And then after that, so when we get to some of the other prophets and some of these other books, those are going to be this like post-exilic Hebrew. They look very different. It's a pretty big change. But that's kind of a summary of linguistic changes. If you want to know more about it, you can check out that book. I do have actually, I don't think I put any examples of it. Another stream of evidence is different terminology. And I'm not going to read all of these. I tried to summarize what were the most important from this book. But one of the very clearest things is the priestly and the non-priestly sources. They call the same mountain different names. And so the J source and the priestly source, they call it Mount Sinai, and that happens over 20 times. But then the other sources, they call it the Mountain of God or Mount Horeb. And we get that because they're from different areas and they're from different time periods. And so they have different names for the same places. There's a bunch of other one I just thought was really funny in the J source. Anytime there's a euphemism for sex, it's from the J source. I thought that was a little comical because I didn't know that. For some reason, this school wouldn't just use the word for sex. They always have a euphemism, and it changes what euphemism that they use. I'm glad someone laughed at that because I was feeling a little weird. Oh, and the other one, I knew some of you would like to know, the J source, so those that have the Yahweh, that's the only time the word Sheol is used. And so I thought that was interesting. Did you have a thought?
What is Sheol?
Sheol is this place, the place for the dead. And so in a lot of the Psalms, David like, do not take me down to Sheol. And so before we have this, like the idea of hell was a Greek influenced idea. And in Hebrew and in Greek, there's all these different words that we will translate as place of the dead or lake of fire or the fiery pit. They're all different words in Greek and Hebrew.
It means the same thing. Maybe.
No, they have different ideas.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
So for Jews, Sheol was this resting place that you would go when you would die, and you're waiting for a resurrection. But that idea changes over time for Jews, which part of that is how we track these different sources, is their ideas and theology kind of develop and change.
I was just going to say the same thing. I thought Sheol, or however you say it, was sort of a not quite dead place, sort of a middle, not quite middle.
It is an
It's not.
purgatory might
It's
be
not
the
really
word.
a middle place. It's not like purgatory, but it's just not quite dead either.
Yeah.
It's
So-
not alive either.
And that gets
We don't have
break.
we don't have any concept for that.
and part of that is generally for Christians, like we believe we're spirits and we're kind of encased in the body, but for a lot of people they believe I'm primarily a spiritual being. So it doesn't really matter if I have a body or not. For Jews, it's you have to have a body to be human. And so this resting place is while you await a resurrection so that then you can go through judgment. But you have to, there's this waiting period until the end of time. You can kind of see that influenced like with Abraham's bosom in the parable that Jesus tells about Lazarus. And there's people that are waiting, and it doesn't seem very pleasant for anyone to be waiting. But yeah, there's different terminology that is used. The other one I thought was fun. Congregation is the only time it's used is with the priestly source. And the priestly source really cares about numbers. So they're the ones that like measure things, and they kind of seem like nerds, so I might be one of them. The other one, and I did not spend a lot of time on this, is consistent content. And so if y'all are interested, I did want to read this story, which is of the revelation of God's name. Because this is when it's going to be really clear. We're going to see, oh, this kind of looks a little different. Would someone be willing to look at Genesis 4:26? If you have a Bible. And might someone else look at Exodus 6:2 and 3?
I'll do 4.
Does anyone else want to read Exodus?
4:26.
Is it was yeah 4:26?
I'll do the Exodus.
Oh, great, thank you.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, men began to call upon the name of the Lord.
So in this story, this is right after Cain and Abel. It says in that translation, they began to call on the name of the Lord, and that's a translation of Yahweh. So this makes up one of the big difference in the sources. It's when did people begin to call God Yahweh? And so in this passage, it says that they called him that from the very beginning of time. Like Adam and Eve are still alive, it's way back then. But then we're going to see something a little different that John's going to read.
God also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. How far are we? That's it. Yeah.
Oh, is that it? Okay. He goes on and introduces the name Yahweh to him. And so in that one, he says, I am God Almighty. It's El Shaddai is the Hebrew. And I didn't tell them my true name, but now Moses, I'll tell you my true name. And so that kind of goes in when we talk about this different origins. One of them is a little more centered on Moses. So Moses is very special. He's the first one to know the name Yahweh, the name of God. And in the other ones, it's kind of always been from the very beginning that kind of follows the story of Abraham. There is a bunch of other examples that there's just different ideas that are going to follow through these different sources. And we'll skip through this stuff. The other part to know is just these were different schools. And so the D source is very close to Jeremiah. And we have a chart we'll look at later that's going to have this as the different schools. But what I think is really cool is the priestly source is the same authors of Ezekiel and Nehemiah. And so they could have been the same school kind of writing these same texts together. Or the prophet Hosea is the same as the non-priestly sources. I just think that's really fascinating. And there's a lot of other history that has to do with when you follow these sources, the way they understand history, and it's too much, and you can look at that book if you want. Okay, there we go. That was our catch-up that we didn't get at last week. So there's this other idea that we're going to see, and it's this idea of convergence or doublets. And that is simply, you can kind of line up these two sources, and you can read them beside each other. So when you read Genesis, it's almost like there's two Genesis that go together. I put a whole outline of Genesis through the different sources. We are not going to look at it in here. If you want to, when I send the PowerPoint out, you are welcome to look at it on your own. But we're not going to do that in this class today. And we won't emphasize too much more on the sources. It's just good to know. You can kind of line them up together and read the differences. But as we go back to our scholar hats, and so we think about, there's different sources, it should change some of the way that we read. So pay attention to these different doublets. Because as we get into Genesis, we're going to see these different doublets. If you wanted to look this week at some very clear examples, these are ones that you can look at if you want to. So when the name of Israel is changed, like Jacob to Israel, there's two stories, and they're a little bit different. If you remember, Abraham kind of goes into Egypt, and another time he goes to this other kind of tribal leader and he lies about Sarah being his wife. There's 2 versions of that story. And then also the 2 creation stories. And when you line these up, they all have similar themes if you look at it as these different sources. Again, we're not going to look at those in here. But there's one other structure I want to tell you about, and this one makes me really excited. Has anyone ever heard the word chiasm or a chiastic structure? So we've talked about these in lectionary before, and that's this really prevalent poetry mechanism in Jewish poetry. So when you think of a poem in English, what makes a poem? Like kind of the mechanics of a poem.
It rhymes.
It rhymes. That's the biggest thing. It rhymes. What else might there be?
The tempo is similar.
Yeah, it might have this cadence that kind of goes through it.
It's a story.
So there's a story, yeah. Poems oftentimes are stories, and they're condensed stories. So instead of being really long like in prose, you shrink it down.
Beautiful language.
There is, yeah, the language, we call it poetic language. So there might be a lot of imagery that is in it. Sometimes there can be acronyms that are in poetry, but that one, rhyming, that's what really makes up English poetry.
There are many different kinds of rhyming.
That's true. There are. Like exact
I had a
rhyme.
little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. But there's also the rhyme called sprung rhyme or spring rhyme
Spring rhyme.
that Emily Dickinson pioneered.
Okay.
And I can't give you, I can quote a lot of Emily Dickinson. I can't give you a good example. But it was, I don't know that it was unique to her.
Okay.
You know.
Is that the same as like kind of irregular rhyme or?
It's not irregular, but it departs from traditional rhythm and
Oh, interesting. Okay.
and goes back to like maybe she might have a sentence or a statement or a line that goes way back up 16 lines earlier
Okay.
and there's a certain resonance there.
Hey,
It
that's
doesn't
it.
have to be an exact rhyme. It's a sound, not a rhyme.
That might be kind of similar to this. So Jewish poetry sometimes would have rhyme, but that wasn't the main mechanism of Jewish poetry. It takes something that we call parallelism, and that's that things repeat. And so sometimes you might have a line that exactly repeats itself. Sometimes it might say the exact opposite. So I'll have one thought and then the exact opposite thought right beside each other in one line. And sometimes those lines will be progressive as an idea, but they're, instead of sound-based, it's idea-based, and it repeats. And that's the same mechanism. But sometimes that parallelism, you can stretch it out and make really large structures. Almost kind of what, it kind of sounds like maybe a little bit of Dickinson. But we call these chiastic structures. And so we're going to look at a really easy example that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So this is a really simple chiastic structure. And what is cool about chiastic structures is they'll put the focus right in the middle of it. And so this is going to be kind of prevalent as we read through Genesis, is these ideas of parallelism or chiastic structures. And so when Jesus tells whoever exalts himself will be humbled, the idea there is you need to humble yourself. And so that kind of becomes the main point when he's giving this sermon. Or not Sermon on the Mount. Sometimes, and I apologize for the poor graphic, they can be larger. So this is an outline of Psalm 110. And so it begins with Yahweh establishes a king, and it ends with that on the very last verse. And then the next thought is Yahweh is sent out to conquer, and then it ends with the person going out to conquer. And then there's this day of power or a day of wrath, but the middle of this Psalm 110, kind of the focus of the whole psalm is Yahweh making this oath with Israel, this covenant with them, that Yahweh will always be with them. And so chiastic structures are sometimes hard for us to pay attention to. So I'm bringing it up kind of in our introduction because I want you to look for things that repeat. And so this is kind of connected to those doublets And kind of as I've kept saying, Genesis is still one book, and it's intentionally organized. A lot of the times these doublets from different sources, they're put together because that's a way of doing poetry in Hebrew, and it puts a focus on the middle. So our next slide, we're going to look at a really long chiastic structure, and it's 3 chapters long. So it's Genesis 6 through 9. So here's all the verses if you wanted to look at it.
Wow.
And it's a lot. So I made a summary of it. But it mentions Noah, it mentions the sons, it mentions the ark, it mentions the flood, it mentions a covenant. My hands are getting too small. There's a connection with food. So they either run out of food or the doves bring back food. There's a command from God. There's a series of 7s. And then there's them either coming in or coming out of the ark. A door or a window is opening and closing. There's a number 40. There's a number 150. But then in the middle of both of them is God remembers Noah. And so what's really, why I bring this part up, sometimes people really want to pull like the story of Noah apart, the flood narrative, and they'll look at it as the 2 different versions. But you miss out from this really beautiful poetry when we do that, when we don't read it as a whole. And this whole story gets arranged to have this focus. God remembers Noah. When you're reading this, like if you're reading through Genesis, you will probably miss this. But what might happen is as you get really close, these ones are only a couple verses apart. And so like right after each other, it has the number 7, it has 40, it has 150. God remembers Noah, 150, 40. Another door opens and closes. And so then you're like, oh, wait, that all repeated itself. Maybe there's a chiasm going on here. And then you can kind of expand it and see what it might be telling. Does that sound familiar, like something you may have heard before?
No.
So pay attention. When you read Psalms, look out for repeats and look out for these chiasms. And if you're in our Sunday school class, we're actually, this Sunday, we're in the middle of a giant chiasm in the book of Acts.
So what would be a very brief definition of chiasm?
It is a repetition with the focus in the middle. It's like a purematic repetition with the focus being in the middle.
Thank you.
Are you gonna send us a copy of this PowerPoint?
Yes, yeah, I will email this out.
Thank you.
When you did the podcast for this Sunday, did you do 3 and 4? Because Caroline only did 3 last time.
We did 3 and 4.
So you did 3 and 4.
Yeah.
She forgot 4 was included.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're gonna look at it in the podcast, and it's shorter. It's only 20 minutes. So that's our scholar hats. These are all the different areas that we covered last week as we finish now with chiastic structure. But there's some other scholar hats that we want to keep on. So not just ideas to know. There's certain questions that are really good to ask. So one question when you're reading through things is try to ask yourself, what source might this story have originated from? And that might inform a little bit with what you're reading about it. Another question to ask is, what is the author trying to say? And that's a different question than what does the Bible mean when it says X? Because as we're looking at in this class, there are different authors that make up each book. So really try to pay attention what that author might be trying to say in their kind of smaller text. And if you can in this class, forget about the rest of the Bible and only think about Genesis. It'll kind of help Genesis come to life and begin to jump out when we can try to do that.
Are you suggesting that the authors impart some bias into what we've always called the inspired Word of God?
Definitely. And they have different ideas that are competing even with itself. And that was one idea we looked at last week. The main story for Israel, and it's the word, when Jacob is named Israel, it's he wrestles with God. And this idea of wrestling makes up most of the Hebrew Bible. It's the identity for how we read Scripture, or how Jews read Scripture. And that's part of why we get these different voices right there they have different ideas. But they're put together on purpose. I wanted to teach you another word. So there is a word that's primeval or ancestral history. We're going to get to that in a moment on our next couple of slides. But the other one is this idea of mythic and legendary and historical. Does anyone remember what myths were that we talked about last week?
They're kind of like a universal truth.
Yeah, so it's a story that has universal ideas. A lot of it has theological implications, but really like creation myths in particular. John, would you mind closing that door a little? They are explaining something about God and the way God relates to humanity. So that it's these very big universal ideas. There's another term that we use is legendary. So some characters we consider mythic, which we'll explain in a moment. Others are legendary and others are historical. And I find these are good to know. So in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we call them the mythic chapters or the primeval chapters. And the characters there are all very important. They're poetic characters, and all of their names have big meanings. So Adam, like we say in English, is a Hebrew word, Adam, and it just means human. And so that name, it's very meaningful. He's he's a human. It represents all of humanity. Same thing with Eve, means life giver. Abraham, do you know what the word Abraham is? Father Abraham, and many sons. It means father of many nations. So before Abram was the first name, was the father of a nation. And then it becomes the father of many nations. And so then all the names that we're going to read in these first few chapters of Genesis, they're kind of representing big swaths of humanity. And they're really condensed with their words or with their names. You can almost think of them more like titles than you would as names. That's one thing to pay attention to when we read it.
So when the original people, whoever wrote these, they weren't just thinking of a name like John or Alexander. They were thinking of this title then.
I think title is a better way to think of it.
Yeah.
Even if maybe when someone was writing it, some people could have thought it was like a literal story. But the names are they're more like titles than like an individual name.
Yeah.
Another one is legendary. So when we get to, this is kind of outside of Genesis, but some of it holds true. But so David is a historical figure. But what we know from some historical records is that, that's jumping into history. I meant to jump back to Abraham. So Abraham, Abraham again is like another title. So there could have been someone named Abraham that was thousands and thousands of years old. But some of the stories about Abraham get mixed up, and they don't quite make sense. So Abraham might fall into someone we would call legendary. That again, we're dealing with a title that's describing someone, and so some of the stories could be real, but Abraham probably wasn't his name. It's more like a title, and so I wanted to bring that part up too. I mixed up my use of title there. Does that make sense? The difference with mythic and legendary. Legendary is like a historical person, but some of the details are stretched out, including the name. Where mythic is like universal kind of statements on humanity and things like that.
Well, what's the difference between legendary and historical?
Historical.
Has a date of death and birth. It's a real person.
Yeah, real. Yeah, kind of. And the details are all pretty historical, rather than being stretched to be a storytelling device, kind of thing. I told you I would come back to this chart, and this was what I meant to share last week, and it somehow got out of my notes. But the chart that I ordered a few weeks ago that's still not here. So we're going to have a few charts like this that I'm going to keep in this room for us to look at. It arranges when the different books were written. So I thought some of you might want to know that. I find this to be pretty cool. And what I like about this chart is it kind of groups, when I was talking about there's kind of different schools that wrote books together. So like the D source is in Jeremiah, were probably the same school that wrote those different things. Or J and E are the same with Hosea. So they're kind of in the same school and from the same time zone. And then the P source is the same as Ezekiel. I think that's really cool when you begin to see those kind of influences. It's a lot of fun. But this is nice because it kind of shows you with the history of Israel when each of them were written. Before we move on, does anyone have a question or want to stare at this a little longer?
That's interesting.
That's a good
Yeah, I meant to have this in my notes. There was a moment where I was like, did I miss that? And I went back through my notes and I couldn't find it. So I thought I had put it in, but it got lost.
Didn't you say that when there's a first and second of the book, it's on two separate scrolls?
Yeah, so,
But those look like they're two different time zones.
well, so this is Isaiah. So
That's
the idea with Isaiah is that there was a first Isaiah that was written, and then later, like another editor came around and added a second layer of Isaiah.
So it wasn't just one story that couldn't fit on one.
Yeah. So that was like the book of Samuel or Kings was just
That's a
one.
good example, because the tone of Isaiah, right around chapter 40, changes completely.
Yeah. We've actually, I think, mentioned that in lectionary, even with Christopher sometimes. How there's like a really dreadful tone and there's like a more optimistic tone. Almost like one was before an impounding war and one is after, and everything kind of worked out. Oh, that's more. This is more, if you want to go back and look at this in the notes. So there's more than just the four sources. There's other things that come in that make up the Pentateuch. Sometimes they're just different stories or codes. We only say four because those are the main ones. So this has an example, like there's a covenant code or a holiness code that may have been like some of the earliest written parts of the Bible that were floating around and get put into them. That's not important. This one is. We're going to look at an outline of Genesis. And so the main way that we kind of divide Genesis, you can think about it as primeval history and ancestral history. And the reason that we call it like that is the primeval history, that again, that's a term that we just Bible scholars use because they like big words. It's kind of some like people will call it the history of all of humanity. And that's because it's this universal way of describing everyone in all of creation, in all of the world. And so that's what primeval means. But then there's this connecting story right in between that's its own kind of special segment in Genesis chapter 11. And that's when Abraham begins to kind of be alluded to in the book. And Genesis 12 starts right with this really big, powerful covenant to Abraham. And it's one of the first covenants that you see in the Bible, so it becomes a really big marking point. But we call that the ancestral history. And that begins to describe like the three kind of patriarchs of Israel. So this outline comes from the Oxford Annotated. So if you have the Oxford Annotated Bible, this is the same outline that you can find in there. But there's other ways of breaking or of doing an outline to Genesis as well. This one I really like, and so I'm gonna send a video animation that like it makes up this chart. I think it's two separate videos, so it breaks it up through chapters 1 through 11 and chapters 12 through 50. I mentioned last week some of my favorite sources. One of them is called the Bible Project. So, and if you don't remember when I was talking about it, if you really want to think more of the Bible as one big book that goes all together, the Bible Project is a great source for that. And so they kind of animate the whole story of Genesis, but they also draw some connections on how it tells the whole story of all of the Bible, which is why I really think Genesis is a powerful book to study, because it starts off in a garden, and there's a tree, and it brings life, and God is there with people in the garden, and that's how the Bible ends, is right at that same place. So you could almost think of the Bible as like a great chiasm, and in the middle is Jesus, which is kind of a fun way to think about it. But I'm going to send a video of this, and it'll be fun. Does anyone have questions? I don't know if you can even see this at all.
Can't
It's
see.
kinda, yeah, it's pretty small. Sorry. Now, oh gosh, do I want to do this? Okay. So
Jimmy Buffett.
yeah. So do y'all know this song?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Can you sing me the chorus?
Wasting away in Margaritaville. I don't know all the words.
Do you know the next line?
Looking for my lost sugar.
Some- Shaker of salt. Yeah.
Some people say.
So when I was in school, so I grew up as I said before, I grew up fundamentalist. So I wasn't really allowed to watch TV or listen to the radio. So I never knew this song. But it was my first year in college, and the course that I had was covering through Genesis. And as we made it through primeval history, so chapters 1 through 11, so here this professor comes out with his guitar, and he had a song that went to Margaritaville, but it was wasting away in primeval, trying to find a way to bring sin to a halt. Adam says it's the woman to blame, but they know that they both were at fault. I found a video of it on YouTube that someone recorded from their phone, and it's not that good of a recording, but I didn't know if you would want to hear the song or not.
Sure.
Okay.
He probably doesn't sing it as well as you do.
No, he sings a lot better. He was actually pretty good at singing. I was searching for a way to bring sin to a heart. Searching for a way to bring sin to a heart. Actually, I think I only downloaded the sound of it. Well, that's all right. You got the idea of it.
Yeah.
Man, I got you all excited, and I'm not going to tell you I feel bad about that. It's just that was a fun little song. That was the end of the PowerPoint for today. Actually,
You did good.
we did do good. So I was hoping we could have more. I thought we would have more discussion in the beginning. So after kind of covering all of this nerdy stuff, we're not going to do this the rest of the time. What have you thought about what we looked at so far?
I think it's fascinating. I didn't know anything about it.
What are we not going to do with this?
We're not going to be as this nerdy through the rest of it. So there you go. I wanted to bring it up on there. What have you thought about though? I know we talked last time about does it make you uncomfortable, and you kind of said no.
No, not at all. I mean, I think it helps to understand.
Let's hope that I can retain it all. This is
Yeah.
a challenge.
It makes me know how much I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I think it gets complicated. Susan, looks like you might have thoughts.
Oh, I have several. I never knew there were two creation stories.
Yeah.
I just read it as one. And then also I'm confused about who the authors are and the sources. I didn't know there were that many sources.
Mhm.
And how our sources were verbal,
Yeah. Let me go back to
because
that.
they had actually kind of no paper. They had some scrolls and papyrus, but how did it come about? So those sources are what?
So the yellow is oral sources. And so there's different versions of all the sources that people think. This is the one I really like, which is the dual origins. So one of the oral stories was kind of specialized around Abraham, and then one of them was more specialized around Moses. And so those were oral stories, oral traditions. And we looked at it like Moses was part of the northern Israel, which had an Egyptian influence, which I know jumps kind of opposite on the map. Abraham, which was part of the southern Israel, which was the J source, so the Yahweh, had a more connection to Samaria. And so those were oral stories. When Israel and Judah get squished together, that gets written down, and then there's a priestly source that's kind of added. And that's what we're mainly seeing the influence, is this priestly source and these other ones. Actually, I I read something that was really interesting, and you might find this helpful. It was when Israel came back from Persia. So we usually think of Judaism as kind of one monolithic sort of thing, and it's more helpful to think of different Judaisms, that there was, because it wasn't some kind of structured religion, kind of like early Christianity. There was lots of different Christianities, and it took a while for them to come together to the Catholic faith, or that universal faith.
To consolidate.
To consolidate, yeah, and to figure out what the standard was going to be. And so when Israel came back, like when Persia put everyone back in the land, kind of what they told the Jews, the Jewish leaders, is you need to figure out what it is that you believe, because we can't have you guys fighting if we're going to fund you coming back here and rebuild your temple. And so what this dual hypothesis theory is, the two main families, or the two main schools, was the priestly and non-priestly. That was kind of how Genesis got written. And when we begin to see the Bible become standardized, or the Hebrew Bible, is that it was after the Persians, they're like, you need to figure out what you believe and make a story that like a origin story everyone connects with. And that's the new, in scholarship, the new kind of school.
Like the Nicene Creed.
That's exactly like
Alexander
that.
the Great said, figure it out.
Or yeah, a little not Alexander the Great. Is that the one at Constantinople? Who was his name? The Roman emperor. Starts with a C.
Claudius?
Caesar?
No, oh man, my brain just went blank. Yeah, like the Nicene Creed. Yeah. So is it more confusing for you to think about sources, or more helpful?
Well, if sources are real things and not something that you derive out of reading the scripture, it was real.
I think it helped explain some of that duality. Like we were, Genesis 1 is the one creation story, then 2 is the second one. And why do we have two of them?
Yeah, how do you know that?
And what are the differences between the two?
So when we get into Genesis, what?
I was going to ask you to address the Bible as an inspired book. Where does inspiration come in versus stories and fables and myths?
Yeah, so that was one of the things way back in the beginning. Some people will look at like a devotional or religious reading of the Bible and an academic way of reading, like with scholarship, to be conflicting. For me, I don't see that as a divide. For me, I find using academic things to kind of help in my devotional reading of Scripture. So when I kind of have a class like this, I put my scholar hat on and I'll study things. Then I'll take my scholar hat off and I'll say, where's God leading me in this text? When I think about inspiration, to me it doesn't mean like a book fell from the sky or someone became a zombie and went like, and read something. The Bible has been one of, throughout history, the most spectacular, moving pieces of literature that there is. Even if you go to a secular university, you're going to read through Job. People know the books of Genesis because they're powerful stories that describe humanity, that describe the way we see the world. I look at that and I'm like, that's inspiration, because it's inspiring to me and it helps me become a better person. I don't quite see that though as like people being zombies and writing things.
There are people who do feel that way though.
And I grew up thinking like that. There was another question before yours.
Well, back to the Persians telling the Jews they needed to get their act together. I kind of thought, or from, I don't know from which study, but that when the exile happened and they were taken into Babylon, that's when synagogues started, right? As small groups. I mean, it was more the Jews who were thinking, we've got to get our story together. And so rather than having the temple where they all... That
actually brings up a good point. So
I didn't realize it was the Persians saying, come on, get...
Well,
I thought it was more inspired by their own people.
Both happening. And there could have been like a Persian influence for them to standardize like a creedal kind of belief. But even as we go back, so in we call it Second Temple Judaism, there's 4 main groups. One of those is the Sadducees, which is the priests. And the others is Pharisaical Judaism, which were the rabbis. And so you could even think of those as being the priestly and the non-priestly ones. So Judaism today, which is very Bible-based, they are descendants of the Pharisees, and we call it rabbinical Judaism. But back in the Second Temple, there was some Jews who were very interested in studying the Torah and those types of things, the Pharisees. There were others that were more interested in the temple and the sacrificial system, the priestly ones. So that even that divide existed in Jesus' day. And there was other groups going around as well.
So the rabbinic were the non-priestly?
Correct, yeah.
And
The
the
Pharisees.
Sadducees were the priestly?
Yeah, they were the ones that worked in the temple. Susan, you had asked, though, about how do we know about the different sources? So I'll go back to... Oh, here we go. So there's the 7 different ones. If you wanted to read the book, The Sources Revealed, the first few chapters cover all of this, which is just, it became really obvious once we could translate early Hebrew in the 1800s. Because again, the Christian Bible was in Greek, it wasn't in Hebrew. And so we didn't read Genesis in Hebrew until later. Once we were reading it in Hebrew and we could kind of tell the difference in early Hebrew and later Hebrew, it was very clear that there was 2 main parts of Genesis, both in the actual language that they were using, but also all of the terms that they used, the different focal points that they use, which is why we brought up that doublet chart. You can almost work your way back and line them up. And so there is different... I think Ellen Wright was telling me about in her class with Howard Hess. They went through and like color-coded it. You can almost work your way backwards and see the original ones. When you read it in Hebrew, it's not as easy in English because our translations fix it to make it more harmonious.
So are the doublets the 2 versions?
Yes, yeah, or conversions. So, so Genesis 1 is priestly. Genesis 2 is from the J source, and what it gets really interesting too. So, in Genesis 1, if we want to just look at a difference, and this is a preview of, we might touch on this next week, but how does God create the world in Genesis 1? How? Breath. He speaks. Does God ever touch anything?
Hovering.
Do what?
Hovering.
Yeah, God hovers. So, and God never has a body. God's a spirit. Creation's through speaking. And there's also this idea in Genesis 1 that nothing really, there wasn't any sense in the world until God speaks. In Genesis 2, everything is a little different. Even the names for God are different. And again, the language is different. But in Genesis 2, God has a body. God walks around with Adam and Eve. God forms things. So God takes clay and morphs it together and then touches his mouth and breathes into it. I won't spoil it, but next week we'll look at that breathing and the touching is playing off Egyptian stuff and part of their creation myths. But there's just very different ideas that are presented. And they're both beautiful. It's cool to have both sides. So I'm hearing today some people don't like this idea of sources.
I like the idea.
It's new information.
It can help some shed some light. It can also be distracting. If it begins to take us away from reading Genesis as 1, we can just throw it away. Because the Genesis that we have was written for a point. And it's a beautiful story, and that can be distracting. What else? Is there any other questions before we kind of jump in? Yeah.
I don't read Hebrew, and I'm not planning to learn it, but to my mind, Jesus in the temple 2,000 years ago, what version of Genesis was he being taught?
But so by then the Bible was finalized in what we have today. So Jesus could have been using the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Bible, or he could have had an Aramaic version, which is more likely what he wrote.
version, you said?
So that the Septuagint is a Greek version, but Jesus probably had an Aramaic version. But it would be essentially the same as what we have today.
Okay, that's good to know.
But the Aramaic would have been translated from the Hebrew or the
Yeah, and we had mentioned last week they're very, very similar
Okay.
languages. But that was probably what Jesus spoke, was Aramaic,
Mhm.
kind of as an everyday language. That's in the Gospels the Gospels are in Greek. They'll quote Jesus and they'll quote his Aramaic, like Eli Eli lama sabachthani is all Aramaic. I actually said that wrong. It's Eli. Oh,
I wasn't going to correct
man.
You're not going to get corrected in this.
What else? What things stand out to you or excite you? Donna, I wanted to hear a little bit about the chart that you had.
Well, it's just history. I mean, I don't know what to say about it. It's helped me put things in perspective to know when things, here, I'll pass it around. It's just one page, these are all blank.
Oh, okay. I just clicked print from what you had sent me. I was going to show you just this chart. So this is cool. On this side of the chart is a biblical kind of account of history. So it has according to Judaism, how they would count when the flood happened, when creation happened and when the flood happened, and when Abraham would have been kind of come on the scene and all of that. And on the other side is the secular side of history. So when we use Bronze Age collapse, and all of those types of things are on here. And then the timeline in the middle matches up, so you can see when they would have kind of popped up, which is really exciting. And one thing that you're going to see if you look at this is it was right after the Bronze Age collapse that there was a power vacuum in Judah area. So Egypt leaves the area. There's a Bronze Age collapse. Kind of society falls apart, and then Israel begins to kind of build up, and that's a little bit right after David, and that's when kind of Israel forms as a nation and as a people group, and begin to kind of think of themselves as one people.
Yeah, I read a book, and I forget the title, but it was Why Did Christianity Become Successful? Which was fun. And he was talking about how the Greeks were before that and all the different gods, and he said that how there was that vacuum, and then that happened to be the exact time that the seed of Christianity came and spread. And that's one of the things you say that I don't think that was by accident.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
I think there was divine guidance there.
They don't have to be conflicting if we don't want them to be.